Glad to see you all. Welcome to tonight's program, Why Buildings? The Role of Buildings in Seeking Climate Solutions. We are excited to bring to Kendal two green building specialists from the Resilient Buildings Group in Concord, the state's premier organization working on the front line every day with a mission to reduce carbon pollution. This event has been a long time in the making and required a sudden shift to Zoom format just last week. Thanks to all who rallied at the last minute to make this happen. The event is sponsored by SAFE, Senior Stewards Acting for the Environment, a group of 8 very active Kendal communities stretching from here to the Midwest. The program will be recorded so anyone who missed it can find it soon on the SAFE website. This is the third of our speaker series. The fourth will be on November 11th and will feature Don Kreis, New Hampshire's consumer advocate, overseeing the doings of the Public Utilities Commission. His talk will be The Hard Road to the Soft Path, Energy Policy in New Hampshire. This is another don't miss. So in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce both guests now. Our first speaker is Paul Leveille, High Performance Building Specialist at Resilient Buildings Group. Full disclosure, I have worked with Paul on and off since the 1990s, and I have learned so much from him, and I am deeply grateful. Paul has overseen more than 50 LEED certified projects and has guided countless architects through the thicket of LEED certification. In recognition of this, he received an honorary membership in the New Hampshire chapter of the American Institute of Architects. Paul will be followed by Andrew Hatch, who is an energy efficient program manager at Resilient Buildings Group. In the short time he has been in the Upper Valley working with Sustainable Hanover and others, he has overseen an array of projects that has achieved truly amazing reductions in energy and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. Those of you who heard Julia Griffin's presentation last summer may recall that she singled out Andrew as a key player in making things happen on the ground. After each half-hour presentation, there will be 15 minutes for Q&A. Mary Burton will be fielding questions and keeping everyone on track. If there is interest beyond the time frame, the Zoom is available till 9 p.m. As we move through the evening, it's worth keeping this in mind. 2/3 of the buildings we occupy today will be with us in 2050. The vast majority are not very efficient, are relying on fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. This is like a gold mine of opportunity for energy savings, the mother lode. And tonight you'll see how it's being aggressively exploited. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Stu. That was a very nice introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be with everybody here. Even if we're doing it virtually, it's still nice to see faces on the computer screen and to be with you here too. So let's see, so introductions to ourselves. Stu did a nice job at telling you a little bit about who we are, and Stu did a nice job at telling you all about your next presentation, which sounds very good as well. A little bit of background about who we are. Some of you may know our precursor organization called the Jordan Institute. The Jordan Institute was a nonprofit organization founded to reduce energy use in buildings. It focused mostly on policy and advocacy practices, and it started in 1995. A little while back, they formed a for-profit organization called Resilient Buildings Group, which is the name of our company now. And its mission was to scale up the number of energy efficient buildings in the state and to expand the available energy efficiency services as well. So that's what our staff is focused on now. We do that by utilizing many different services. So here's kind of a listing of some of those services, but to kind of summarize, energy auditing, is a big chunk of what we do. So we audit existing buildings and help the owners figure out what it would take to make those more energy efficient. We work on new building projects, as Stu described. We act as consultants to design teams and construction teams to help them figure out how to green up their building projects, whatever that might mean. Our focus is on energy, so it's usually energy-focused projects. We do construction management, so we'll act as the construction manager for particular construction projects if they're what we call energy-centric, so focused on energy efficiency. Excuse me. And we also do commissioning work. We're going to talk a little bit more about commissioning work towards the end, but that's basically verifying that a building's systems work as they're intended, work properly. And then there's Andrew's staff, which work focused entirely on utility incentives and helping people implement energy efficiency and then helping them to cover some of the cost of those energy efficiency measures. That's a little bit about who we are. We have a nice website, and I guess I haven't listed it here, but it's resilientbuildingsgroup.com is the website. I think we may have listed it at the end. So if you wanted to learn more about who we are and what we do, meet our staff. They're shown on our website as well. One of the exciting services that we've recently added is aerial thermal thermography. So this is infrared thermography. We recently purchased a very powerful and very accurate, if you will, drone that allows us to fly over buildings, fly over campuses, and take a look at the buildings from the sky. And so the thermography basically allows us to see heat loss. So in this particular picture here, what we're seeing is we're seeing heat loss through the roof, and then heat loss through some portions of the building's facade and some of the windows. And so it kind of allows us to do kind of a quick assessment of several buildings all at once. Kind of a nice service that we've recently added. A little bit of an agenda. We've done introductions to ourselves and to you folks as well. We'll talk about the state of affairs and point out the fact that the building codes are actually headed this way, that the building codes, the people who put the codes together, have promised that they will drive towards net zero energy buildings. We'll talk a little bit more, excuse me, about what that means. And then we're going to have some case studies where we take a look at some projects that are particularly in your area up in the Upper Valley. And probably folks are familiar already with a chart like this particular chart or charts like this. And what we're seeing in this chart in the blue line is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And over the last 600,000 years, we're actually able to measure the CO2 concentrations because we can actually drill holes in the Antarctic ice, and we can drill down to 600,000 years worth of ice, and we can examine the concentration of gases in the little bubbles that are trapped in that ice, and we can measure carbon dioxide in those little bubbles. It's quite amazing that they can do that, and actually some of that work is pioneered here at UNH. And so for 600,000 years, we have, or they have, examined what the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are, and it kind of changes over time, as we would expect. And what we see is that over the time, never have we gone over about 350 parts per million of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That has never happened in the last 600,000 years. Does anybody here in this group know where we are today? How many parts per million of CO2? Anybody happen to look that up today or no? So I looked it up today, and it varies, of course, up and down a little bit and seasonally as well. But right now we're at about 413 parts per million. So in our last 600,000 years of existence, we have never been there. We have never been at 413 parts per million. So really what we're doing is we're running a giant experiment with our planet Earth that has never been done before. And so we don't really know, or I shouldn't say we don't really know because because some smart people know what's going to happen, or we all of us can start to see, we are seeing the effects of increasing CO2 emissions, because in the yellow line that you see here at the bottom of the graph, that is the temperature line. And you'll notice that the temperature kind of marches in lockstep with CO2 concentration. So as CO2 levels rise, it basically creates a greenhouse blanket over our planet and traps those warm gases inside our greenhouse, basically. So they march in lockstep, and so as CO2 levels rise, our planet warms up as well, and we certainly all see that today. Probably this past week, some of you have probably listened to National Public Radio and seen or heard, I guess I should say, some of these stories. Climate change is a national security risk, the Pentagon reported this past week. They issued this report here, the Department of Defense Climate Risk Analysis, pointing out that this is a very serious national security risk, and they identify severity of storms, the ability to get their troops where they need to be, climate migration or migration from people who are affected by climate crises, et cetera, et cetera. So they identify many, many, many reasons that the climate change is a risk for our national security. And then you may have also seen or heard again that this week, the United Nations also came out with a report that says that nations are about to make new pledges, and Andrew will talk a little bit more about that. But the United Nations said it's still not enough. All of these commitments that we're about to make in Glasgow, the United Nations says do not go far enough. But kind of, moving from the gloom to the positive things, there are places around the country, around the world, that are moving aggressively. I was very excited when a few weeks ago now, I guess, almost a month ago, the Boston City Council approved major emissions cuts. It shouldn't say really approved here, it really should say require, because the city council has said that now for owners of bigger buildings, I think it's 22,000 square feet or more, they will be required to make emissions cuts and prove those emissions cuts, because the city of Boston has similar climate change reduction goals as the town of Hanover, for instance. We do a fair amount of work in the Boston area already, and so we're kind of excited about helping some of these building owners implement those measures to cut their emissions. So taking a look at kind of the bigger picture first, here in the United States, buildings account for about 48% of our energy use, 48%. Now you could further break down that pie by saying buildings operating energy, excuse me, buildings operating energy is about 40%. And the other 8% in buildings is what we would call embodied energy. So that's the energy that goes into producing the building materials. So really about 40% of the energy that we use in the United States is attributed to buildings operations. So the biggest piece of the pie, really. In New Hampshire, it's actually a little bit more severe than that. In New Hampshire, 48% of our buildings are where energy gets used. I'm sorry, 59% in New Hampshire, compared to 32% in transportation. And industry isn't too much of a big piece of the pie in New Hampshire at about 9%. But New Hampshire, 59% of our energy goes into the operation of buildings. Now, there are some excellent groups that are working out there. One of my particular favorites is a group called Architecture 2030. And they've been around now for maybe 15 or 20 years or so. And what they did is they came out with this very simple premise, which is that all buildings must become carbon neutral by the year 2030. And so it's a very simple thing to say. And what does it mean? It means that by the year 2030, our buildings should be fossil fuel free. and the power that they do use should come from renewable sources. So it's a pretty simple thing to say. It's kind of a fairly simple concept to grasp as well, I think. You know, make our buildings very, very energy efficient, and then power them with some kind of renewable energy source, whether that might be solar or biomass or wind or something like that. And so they said, you know, we know that we're not going to get there all at once. So over time, we'll have these intermediate targets. And so by the year 2020, last year, they were saying that 80% of the buildings should get there. Now, we know that there are lots and lots of existing buildings out there. And so those are what they are. However, Andrew will talk to us about how there's a tremendous opportunity in retrofitting of existing buildings. But also we're building new buildings all the time. So those new buildings that we're building ought to be in these ranges as well. So if we're building a new building today, we should be a little better than 80% better than the average building of the same sort of type of building. What was super exciting to me when this kind of simple mantra came out from Architecture 2030 is that it was adopted by not only the US Conference of Mayors, but it was also adopted by the American Institute of Architects, you know, an organization that Stu, I know, and maybe others here, but Stu has been a member of for a very long time. And Stu would tell us that it's a very conservative group, 62,000 members strong in the United States. And they adopted to this. They said, we commit to this. We promise that as we design new buildings, we will meet this challenge. That was astounding to me. That was very exciting and very astounding to me. And I know it can be done. We've certainly participated in projects that meet these goals. And then just to kind of give you a sense of what those targets mean, and we'll talk a little bit more about energy use intensity, but if you had a single family detached home, its average site EUI, so I'm going to define this a little bit here. So if you can see where I've got my cursor right now, a single family detached home has an energy use intensity, that's what EUI stands for, of about 45,000 BTUs per square foot per year. We're still using the Queen's English standards here. We're not on the metric system like the rest of the world, so we're still using BTUs, British thermal units. And so that's what a typical single-family detached home might be. And so the 50% target would be 22.9 or 22,000 BTUs. Our 60% target, again, remember we said that right now we should be building buildings to this target right here, around the 80% mark, around 2020. So if we're building a new building today, a new single-family detached home, our target really ought to be 9,000 BTUs per square foot per year. That's a very, very tiny amount of energy as an energy budget, if you will, for running a house, for operating a house. But there are many, many, many examples around the country, around the world too, demonstrating exactly that. And in fact, there are many examples that demonstrate 0 as a number, meaning that they're producing all of their own energy. So they've made the building super, super energy efficient, and then they powered it with some kind of renewable energy system. So that then their EUI, their energy use intensity at that point, is 0. So we know it can be done. We've seen it. We've been involved with several projects like that as well, including a couple of Stu's. So where are we now? We know that we have these global issues, not just of climate change, but there are emerging diseases as well. I just heard on the way home tonight about a West Nile virus case in Vermont. The first of this year, I think, is what the report said on the radio. That's a disease that's brought to us because of changing climate that we would not have seen in the past. And other issues too, like habitat destruction, crop production loss, and air and water pollution. Those are kind of big picture issues that, you know, sometimes are kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around. But really they're tackled at the state and national level by energy policy, by environmental policy, by transportation policy, and even locally. Our zoning rules, our land use practices, where we site buildings, meaning that we have to drive from point A to point B instead of making them pedestrian friendly. So there are local solutions to the global issues. What is it that the sticker says? Think globally, but act locally. So we know that that's a true thing. I mentioned earlier on about the city of Boston requiring emissions reductions. There are cities like Boston, Washington, D.C., Washington State, Oregon State, that are now requiring building owners to put on the front door their energy quotient, how much energy they use compared to other buildings. So picture yourself as a would-be buyer of an office building, and you're comparing office buildings. You don't know about their energy use, except that if you're in Washington, D.C., for instance, or Boston, then you can look at the sticker on the front door and you can say, oh, this building earns an A+ rating, whereas this building earns an F rating. So, if otherwise it's apples to apples, I'm going to choose the A+ building or the A building or the A- building because I know that I'm going to have reduced costs. And really what we're asking, does your building come with a sticker? When you buy a building, is there a certification or some kind of sticker that tells you how good it is? When we buy a car, it comes with that, right? And the car costs a lot less than the building does. So it seems to me like the building should come with a similar sort of sticker. So we need to find ways to adapt our built environment so that we can adjust to more temperature extremes and ensure that we've got a safe and livable future. That's part of what we're doing with these energy efficient buildings. Passive House is a method, is a certification tool that we can use for retrofitting existing buildings and also new buildings. It's a German standard. Interestingly, it actually started in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s. Interest here waned because oil price plummeted. It went to Germany. It got perfected in Germany, and then it came back to the United States. And now it's back to the United States in really big, robust form. So it's kind of like the gold standard today of how do we design buildings to not only be super energy efficient, but also very comfortable. And that's really what Passive House is all focused on, is creating buildings that are very comfortable. Because if we've got really super well insulated buildings, the wall is now the same as the room temperature in the wintertime, as opposed to being cold. So I don't want to sit up against the window. I don't want to read a book by the window because the window is cold. Passive House blows all of that away and ensures that we're designing comfortable buildings. So if you're interested in learning more about that particular program, there's a great series that I've been participating in, a great webinar series that takes place every week. And they also have podcasts as well. And excuse me, one of them, a recent one, was by Dr. Diana Ergay-Borsatz. She's the vice chair of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So she talks about the role of buildings in mitigating climate change. And so I'd encourage you to check her out, check out her podcast or listen to the podcast that she's in. I've given you the whole address here. And as I said, you'll get this presentation as well. But I'm certain if you just looked up her name, which is a little bit difficult to spell, you could find her that way as well. So I'm going to stop there, and maybe Mary, maybe this might be a place for us to ask a few questions of me before I turn it over to Andrew.
Absolutely. Sharon and partner. I see one hand up.
Bob has a question.
Bob, go right ahead.
That was a wonderful presentation, and I really enjoyed it. I was wondering, when you measure heat loss from a house, what units do you use to measure the heat loss from a house?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you. We would typically measure it in BTUs, British thermal units. So this might be a little bit too much in the weeds, but heat loss measured from a house, there would be several ways that you could lose heat through the surface areas, through the walls, through the roof, through the slab or basement or whatever. You can lose heat by infiltration, meaning cold air coming in or warm air escaping to the outside. That's called infiltration. And then the third way would be ventilation. So you might have a bathroom fan, for instance, that runs. So those are the three ways that you lose heat. Each one of those three different ways would be measured in BTUs. So it's a fairly simple mathematical calculation to calculate what the heat loss is based on the outside temperature, based on the inside temperature, based on the R value of the walls, based on the R value of the windows. I teach a class at NHTI for the architecture students, and I actually have them do that with a hypothetical house longhand. I have them do it without any computer program so that they can kind of get the feel for what it takes, and it's not terribly difficult.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Ellis. And Ellis, you're muted right this minute.
I've got to unmute.
There you are.
On the energy audit question, what is there an optimal time of the year to do an energy audit?
Excellent question as well. I guess I would say it depends. It depends on the building type. One of the very good tools that we use for doing energy audits, again, it depends on the building type, but we commonly will use our infrared camera. So not only do we have the infrared drone that can take footage from above, we also have a very nice camera that we can just carry with us, and we can look at the building both from the inside and the outside. In order for that to work, we need at least a 15 degree temperature difference between indoors and outdoors. So we could either do it in the summertime if air conditioning is on and it's warm outside and cool on the inside, or ideally wintertime is a good time to do that too, because it's really cold outside and it's pretty warm on the inside. So the infrared is very vibrant, very easy to see at that point. Again, it kind of depends on the building type. If it's an office building or school building, usually all of those sorts of building envelope issues, I'll call them, the shell, are less important, I guess I would say, maybe in quotes. But if it's residential style buildings, then the infrared and the blower door, we also use a blower door as well. And that can be done any time of year. That can be done anytime, but infrared, best in the winter.
May I follow up then?
Yeah.
For an energy audit, is that just a snapshot in time, or do you do an audit over a period of time to average out the heat loss?
Yeah, good question as well. Typically, we would, when we do an energy audit, what we like to do is we like to get at least 3 years worth of energy bills. And then we'll look at those 3 years of energy bills, basically average them out. We'll look for anomalies in them. And then what we'll do is we'll use that information along with the square footage of the building to calculate an EUI. We just talked about the energy use intensity. And so that's what we start with is we calculate the EUI, the energy use intensity. And we say, then we compare that to other buildings of a similar type. And we say, is this building high or is it low? And it sometimes will also help us to pinpoint where to start. If it's fuel, fossil fuel, like gas or oil, that's the big piece of the pie. We're going to start with that. If it's electricity, then we'll look at like electricity opportunities. Does that answer the question, Ellis?
Yeah, more or less. I was really focusing on the infrared measurements, whether that's a snapshot or whether yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yes. So that's, yeah. The infrared is really a snapshot. So again, I would say, if it's a residential type building, best to do that in the winter time, but it will be a snapshot, but it will be a snapshot that will depict ongoing conditions. So if we do a thermal scan of a building and we see one particular wall has missing insulation, that's not just a snapshot, that's a continual thing. It's been like that since it was built, and it will be like that until somebody fixes it as well.
Yeah, we can see that here based on where we have big icicles.
Oh, yeah. We like to say that icicles or ice dams are a poor man's infrared camera. So yes, yep. Yeah, icicles or ice dams are a really good way to determine if you've got, heat loss up above, up in the attic.
We can take a couple other questions and just call out if I'm missing any hands. Otherwise, we'll move forward. Stu.
Paul, just one question on, when we were talking about passive house and how incredibly efficient it is, some people worry about, is it too tight? What's the air quality? Can you
Yeah,
talk about that?
sure. I skipped over that, but yeah, that's a very important question. So my house, for instance, is a super airtight house, and right now I'm looking over at a tiny little register that's up on the wall, and that is connected to a heat recovery ventilator in the basement. So our house is really too tight. It's not too tight for the house. It's not too tight for the building. What Stu is getting at is sometimes people will say, well, you don't want to make a house too tight because houses need to breathe. That's a falsehood. Houses do not need to breathe. In fact, you don't want your house to breathe, because when a house is breathing, what it's doing is it's breathing in and out, and that moisture that it's breathing in and out, which is our moisture that we've generated, is being deposited inside your walls or inside your ceiling or your roof. And that's not a good place to deposit moisture in a building. So yeah, so we build them super, super tight. And nowadays we have the technology to make them almost entirely airtight. And what we do instead is we mechanically bring in fresh air. So the little heat recovery ventilator that I have in my basement, which is about the size of a bread box, has two tiny little computer fans in it. One fan extracts stale air out of the bathroom, and then the other fan brings air into this office and the 2 bedrooms and the living room. And there's a heat exchanger inside there that strips the heat out of the outgoing air and uses that heat to preheat the incoming air. So it's a much, much more efficient way. And what it means is it also means that we always have the same amount of fresh air in the house, as opposed to building your house kind of leaky. And what that would mean is on a windy day, you'd have lots of fresh air. And on a non-windy day, you probably wouldn't have enough fresh air. So it's better to build it super airtight and then control the amount of fresh air yourself.
Anybody else? All right, Sharon, go right ahead. After unmuting.
Yep, after unmuting. So this is just a philosophical question. If we fall behind in all these calculations of, how are we going to catch up? I mean, are we entirely dependent on the goodness of people to hire architects to do the right thing, or governments, local governments to change each state's energy policies?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of like the $64,000 question I think you're asking there. So I guess I don't necessarily know the answer, except maybe to say that it's both or all of those things, right? Some of it's going to have to come from policy. We know the energy codes are going to get pushed that way, but the energy codes get lobbied against. There are organizations that don't like the more and more stringent codes, so they lobby against improving those codes. So it's going to be a combination of things. I think it's going to be policy. It's going to be people advocating for right policy. It's going to be people doing projects and demonstrating projects and educating. Bringing people to those projects. The American Institute of Architects that Stu was describing here in New Hampshire does a great job of doing tours of innovative buildings and teaching other architects. So I think it's everything. All of it has to happen, and all of it has to happen very quickly. And what if we fall behind? I think what we're hearing from scientists and from people who are very smart is we have fallen behind. And what we're planning to do isn't enough. We have to plan to do more. We have to plan to be even more aggressive than what we're planning to do already. So yeah, we have to drive forward really fast.
All right, I think we can turn it over to your colleague, Paul.
Yes, all right. So I'll share the screen again.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Andrew Hatch. So there are two buildings that you'll be able to see when you're traveling around. But as Paul did, I'd like to start a little bit on the big picture and then zoom in to local solutions. As you can see here, the CO2 emissions from building sector are at the highest ever recorded. If you could roll the next slide, please, Paul. So this slide will show that emissions are increasing because we're building faster, and so we're not keeping up with the ever increasing number of buildings being built. And so, to Paul's earlier point, we're lagging behind. The most important thing is that the urban built environment is responsible for 75% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions. The buildings themselves account for 39%. So eliminating those emissions is the key element in addressing climate change. So this just explains, where we are globally and the opportunity that buildings are providing in terms of being able to meet the commitments of the Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide, please. The global share of emissions in 2019 is what this is summarizing here. So as you can see here, the International Energy Agency has identified these different sectors of residential and non-residential buildings and the relationship between their energy consumption and their emissions. And if you aggregate all buildings together, it is the biggest slice of the pie. So a very big opportunity. Next slide, please. The upcoming COP26 in Glasgow, which unfortunately you may have heard, the Queen can't make it, which is really bad news. But hopefully many others can. And it is a very important meeting of all nations to continue to drill down and look very closely at all the commitments that have been made and keep everybody on task. As it says, climate has no borders, and all of these opportunities that we're describing tonight are global opportunities. Next slide. Unfortunately, at the Glasgow conference, the agenda hardly addresses anything to do with retrofitting buildings. There's all the talk about as yet to be developed technologies and concepts. There's a huge amount of emphasis on moving to renewables. But unfortunately, because the retrofitting of buildings is extremely mundane and just hard work, it really isn't getting the press it needs. Next slide. The Bloomberg Business Week that was doing a review of the upcoming conference was making these statements, and I thought it was very interesting because it does match the same statistics that we have in the United States, that deep retrofits will cut a huge amount of energy, and that will make a huge contribution towards climate goals. However, the speed at which this is happening will mean that the building stock currently won't get converted until the year 2500, which is way, way too late. Next slide, please. I am hoping that we'll be seeing more of this in the United States. It heartened me to see that people are protesting to insulate. And that's what we need. People need to get behind this concept and see its benefit and start agitating for this. Next slide, please. So why it's so important is because although we like to talk about electric cars and reducing other forms of emissions, the most important act we can take is to look at our own household energy and how can we reduce it. As it says here, 70% more carbon dioxide emissions from an average household than the average car. Next slide, please. An organization that I am very fond of is the Rocky Mountain Institute. And they put out an awful lot of very good information, but also they're extremely proactive in so many different areas, and they're very strong advocates for the building sector. And as this slide says, that the household energy decisions are driving up to 40% of US energy carbon emissions. And the opportunity is that things like the Google Nest Renew and similar service can help households to eliminate more than 80% of their carbon footprint. And this is technology that we have at our fingertips right here, right now. So it's vital that everybody doesn't see this as a responsibility of somebody else, that it's this exterior and external opportunity that other people have to implement. Everybody needs to look at their own homes and how can they do better to reduce their carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So up in the Upper Valley, I've been working since 2019. My job was created through the advocacy of both the Sustainable Hanover organization and the Lebanon Energy Advisory Committee, who were talking to the utility up here, Liberty, and asking them, why isn't there any form of feet on the street, boots on the ground, promoting programs? And this position was created through Resilient Buildings Group. I now have another 4 colleagues who are doing similar things in other parts of the state. Up in the Upper Valley, it is only electric. There isn't natural gas. So the electric program is what I represent, and it's on the commercial, industrial, and municipal side. And just last year, I oversaw over 200 projects being completed, and I'm going to talk about some of those in a few minutes and give you some ideas of what is going on locally. Somebody asked earlier on about, what can you do locally? The Upper Valley is definitely being a thought leader, and I think you should all be very proud to be residents of Hanover. As you can see, outside not just Hanover and Lebanon, but also in the surrounding communities such as Plainfield, Canaan, Enfield, and so forth, we've conducted projects at all different levels, in all different walks of life, large business, small business, churches, non-profits, and municipalities. And just last year, despite the pandemic, over $1 million of incentives were distributed. And that represented just in 1 year, savings of 6 million kilowatt hours. And if you work on the basis of the cost of a kilowatt hour, that's around about $1 million. So the mathematicians among you will figure out that the return on investment is just 1 year, which is everything that the New Hampshire Saves program purports to be. So we're meeting those claims. As was mentioned earlier, you are going to have Don Crease come to speak with you in a couple of weeks' time from the Office of the Consumer Advocate. And I certainly don't want to tread on his toes. He is a tremendous advocate for the New Hampshire Saves program, and I'm sure he will be giving you a lot of insight into what's going on at the State House. Unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, my colleagues and I were actually at the State House testifying to try to offset the possibility of a new bill completely doing away with the commercial New Hampshire Saves program. on the pretext that it was burdensome, particularly for large businesses. The names that were quoted were BAE Systems. They were talking about Ruger and also about Waterville Valley for some reason, but that may be due to which family owns that. Unfortunately, it was extremely misleading, and I hope that the testimony will actually mean that they will be changing that bill. The word that we're getting is that they are definitely considering that. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing to advocate in the Upper Valley in the coming years. Next slide, please. I am very fortunate that the town of Hanover affords me an office in the Department of Public Works on Route 120. And so I spend probably 4 out of 5 days a week working in the Upper Valley in the field. And I am so happy to be working with like-minded people to help them drive towards the collective goals of Hanover's Ready for 100. This is a very important declaration. And most importantly, it isn't just a token commitment. Everybody's bought into it. It's been approved at town meeting. And obviously now the town is moving as fast as it can forward to achieve its goals of complete renewable energy by 2030, which is literally just around the corner. Some of the work that I've been doing there on the town buildings has been LED lighting upgrades and heat pump conversions. And now we're working on taking a deeper dive, looking into ways to meter and measure what's been going on in the Upper Valley. Next slide. Because if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. This is a well-used phrase, but it's a mantra that we at Resilient Buildings Group strongly advocate. And what I'm doing in Hanover is to work towards providing sub-metering capabilities, because not only are Hanover trying to reduce its energy consumption, but it's also now becoming a producer. Next slide, please. In the last 3 years, Hanover has, as a municipality, moved the needle towards almost complete solar production, where its municipal needs for electricity are almost now met by its ability to produce solar power. This is quite remarkable. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but the commitment of the town manager, Julia Griffin, the town employees is commendable, and the group Sustainable Hanover do an incredible job to continue to advocate for weatherization, for solarize, and I'm sure many of you have heard of their initiatives. I know Dennis is on the call. He is the secretary there, and I sit in on their monthly meetings, and it's extremely inspiring to hear of the multiplicity of initiatives that they are driving forward with in the community. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just run through a couple of local case studies, and I'm going to try to probably involve Paul a little bit, because we've been working on many of these together. Next slide, please. The Lebanon City Hall is quite a landmark, and we were very excited as Resilient Buildings Group to be involved in its complete renovation. The initial work that was done was to do an energy study, and Paul and his team modeled the building and did many of the calculations that brought forward a lot of the incentives that I work with. Here is some of the examples of some of the results that we were able to give to Liberty Utilities to justify the payment of incentives. Over the 2-year period where this renovation was conducted, there were several different initiatives that generated the incentives. In the building envelope, they they were able to get $100,000 worth of incentives. And then on top of that, for replacing the boilers and replacing the chillers and replacing the lighting, they were able to get another 35,000. So it's been a very big project from an incentives point of view. And we continue to support them doing the retro commissioning, which perhaps, Paul, you want to just speak about briefly.
I had mentioned that term earlier on, or commissioning. Retro commissioning simply just means commissioning of an existing building. But yes, so when you put in new equipment inside a building, it's complicated sometimes. And in this particular case, it has a fairly complicated computerized building management system, we would call it. And so oftentimes, everybody has good intentions, and the contractors do a very good job at installing equipment, but item A doesn't communicate with item B very well. And so we've been brought on, as I mentioned earlier, commissioning is a kind of a big part of what we do, to commission those systems in the building. And we basically put the building through its paces and figure out what's not working the way that it should. And then we point it out and we work with the team to fix it.
Great. Next slide, please, Paul. There's just a couple of shots here of some of the lengths that the city of Lebanon went to renovate and insulate this building. You can see on the left 5 inches of spray foam insulation, which makes the building extremely high performance. And on the other side, the best windows that money could buy. This is almost unprecedented in what I've seen locally, and it's exactly the kind of work that Paul was talking about earlier that needs to be done when we're renovating particularly old buildings like City Hall. Next slide, please. The next case study will be close to Stu White's heart, I know, and I would definitely invite him to speak to it if he feels it's appropriate. We're working right now on this building, which is the Gallery and Artist Studios, which actually has only had some work done, but not been complete. The next slide is the building behind it, which is the 3D studio, which was work that was done over 10 years ago now, nearly. And this was at the time one of the most forward-thinking initiatives in the state. Okay, well, Paul was working on this as well. And as you can see from this above shot, there is a rooftop garden. There is extensive solar panels. And this building was built to house a very high energy intensity because there are people doing sculpting, and there are welders, and there are ovens for pottery and things like that that use a lot of electricity. So it was the demand on this building per square foot was extremely high, yet they pursued a zero net energy goal and have definitely achieved that. If you can go to the next slide, Paul. And maybe you could speak to it in terms of the E-gauge.
Yes, happily, sure. So this is a chart from a monitoring system that we have inside the building. And the chart simply, or the device simply measures the amount of energy that the building uses in red and the amount of energy that the solar electric system produces. So here we're looking over the course of a whole year. Over the course of that year, which was, let's see, back in May of 2019, shortly after the building opened to May of 2020, we generated 34,000 kilowatt hours. It's marked here as 34.7 megawatt hours. And, but we used 29.5. So it was actually what we would call a net positive building. So it actually produced more energy than it used, making it better than net zero.
And you can drop to the next slide. It just shows another summary. I think it's not altogether important to go into much more detail, but basically what Paul just said there. So there we have it. In working in Lebanon right now is a better than net zero building. Next slide, please. This is a job that, in fact, Paul and I were right in there yesterday, as this is an ongoing project at the Howe Library. We, Resilient Buildings Group, have been commissioned to do a retro commissioning and analysis of this building. We started earlier in the year, as you can see, with the snow still on the ground, and we did pressurize the building and did the thermal imaging that we discussed earlier. If you drop to the next slide. And what we're measuring there, going back to what Paul was talking about earlier, is the EUI of the building against the benchmarks. And we're trying to determine what opportunities there are for improvement. I think it's fair to say that actually the surprise was that the building is in better shape than many thought. But that doesn't mean that there's not work that can be done. And so what we're engaged in right now is analysis, along with checking out the building systems. One of the reasons for wanting to do this is because the Howe Library has just converted to heat pumps. So it's changing the whole way that the building is heated and cooled. And as with everything where we're talking about moving to renewable energy, job one is energy efficiency. If you don't have a tight building, then you can't size the heat pumps or the heating source appropriately. And with electric heat pumps, particularly in this part of the world, we need to make sure you start with a tight building. Otherwise, it just can't keep up on the coldest days. So we're working with the town to analyze this. And I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say about how it's going, Paul?
Nope, I think I'll hold off for now. Maybe if somebody has questions later, we could answer questions.
Great. So moving on to the next example. The Nugget Theatre, another icon of the downtown. It is unfortunate that the work that we've done hasn't really yet been able to be put through its paces because of the pandemic. What you see on the roof there is a completely renovated HVAC system. If you drop to the next slide, please. They have replaced all of their heating and cooling with these large heat pumps that are on the back side of the Nugget. And they have also done internally conversion to LED lighting. So that's going to be saving another local nonprofit a lot of money over time. And we very much hope as they get back open that the comfort level of the building will also increase. Next slide, please. Then just around the corner, we have a couple of churches. I'm very excited to be working with the faith-based communities. There's a lot of passion and a lot of commitment amongst the congregations to do the best they can with improving the energy efficiency of their places of worship. St. Thomas's Church on the left, just on Wheelock Street, has a very passionate facilities manager there, and I've worked with her and a couple of her congregants to do a lot of work. They have upgraded their HVAC system. They have done a lot of work on their building envelope, and they have converted completely to LEDs. And the building on the right, the Church of Christ, the White Church, that was one of the first jobs I got involved in 2019. And I rather innocently went into the church thinking I was going to meet a passionate but maybe not particularly informed facilities person, only that I was introduced to Steve Shadford, who had just recently retired as the energy guru for the whole of Dartmouth College. And he whipped out a spreadsheet that I can still remember, and I was chastened. And he taught me a few things in 2019 about how to tackle energy efficiency and LED light upgrades at the Church of Christ. So that was a fun one. Other churches are also involved in the area. We've been involved with doing audits and trying to help everybody to improve their buildings. Next slide, please. This is actually a slide to show you how well St. Thomas's Church is doing from all its efforts. This work was provided to me by a parishioner who has been taking the data from Liberty. And as you can see, there is a very steady and strong march of electrical use reduction there. So kudos to them. Next slide, please. The last one I'm really going to feature is the co-op food stores. This is an ongoing project. I'm sure many of you are regular shoppers at this location in Lebanon. Many of you may be members. So you could well be aware of the commitment of the co-op to meet its own stated goals of carbon neutrality by 2030. You drop to the next slide, please. In 2020, RBG were asked to provide an energy study. We did an analysis of a lot of work that had been done over a number of years to analyze opportunities. And at the time, we weren't aware of any actual intent to act. But I think partly because of the energy study and the proof that there was such a lot of savings to be had, along with the potential for incentives from Liberty Utilities, the general manager of the co-op announced in January of this year a multi-million-dollar renovation of the Lebanon store, completely replacing the lighting, all of the refrigerated cabinets and cases, and upgrading the HVAC system. And just in the last couple of months, they have commissioned the VEIC, which is the parent of Efficiency Vermont, to develop a path to carbon neutrality. And I'm partnering with their engineers over in Vermont, and they are working with me to identify opportunities in the New Hampshire stores, as well as working with the co-op over the river in Vermont. Next slide, please. So I took this photograph on Tuesday. So what you're just seeing here is hardly anybody's seen this yet. This is the late breaking news. But I think you can tell just by looking at the color, temperature, the light intensity there. There's a complete makeover there. They're benefiting from saving at least half of their electricity lighting the store and improving the quality of the lighting at the same time. When you combine that with brand new refrigerated casing and upgraded HVAC, we're really looking forward to seeing some very significant savings there. Next slide, please. This is the work that I do to analyze the outcomes of these kind of initiatives. So what I have in my hand there, a light meter, is measuring foot candles on the floor. And this was an interesting moment because the Delhi area had just been in the process of being partially changed over to new LED lighting. So on the left-hand side, you can see the LED lighting, and on the right-hand side, the old fluorescents. And what I'm showing you there with my light meter is that the new LED is more than twice the output of the old. The new LED is about 32 watts, and the old fluorescent was 93 watts. So there again, we're saving over 65% of the electricity, but at the same time, greatly improving the utility of the area, which is very important for the people doing preparation work at the co-op. So there's more than just energy savings here. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to drop through a couple of other examples. As I said, over 200 projects last year, so I could go on for a long time. Omer and Bob's in Lebanon. And then just to mention on the next slide, we've got 2 more of the big box stores on 12A. It's not just small businesses. I partner with the national chains. We've done Hanover's just in the last couple of months. Next slide. And just at the end of last year, we did the Home Depot. So a lot going on in the Upper Valley. So I hope that's given you some form of a sense of local action. And so it's not quite as depressing as some of the global statistics might imply. A lot of work is being done at a local level.
Open with an audacious question, Andrew. Have you ever been brought into a situation where there was considerable opposition in some quarters, or are you not called in until there's been general agreement reached?
What could you be talking about, Mary? Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the issues is obviously there's so much that could be done if money was no object, if you had unlimited amount of resources and time, but everything is incremental. I don't think anybody, even the people within Hanover and Lebanon municipalities, would be the first to say, this is a work in progress. We're never done. We've just got to keep working and incrementally drill down and get better and better. I'm often brought in to help to consult and to pull together proposals and to come up with some statistics which can support some of the claims of returns on investment. In the Upper Valley, some of the largest businesses are extremely sensitive to return on investment. I'll use an example of Hypertherm. I mean, they are used as the paragons of sustainability in the Upper Valley, but they don't have any solar panels on the roof. And there's a reason for that. They have a hard commitment to a return on investment of 3 years or less. And solar doesn't cut it for them. I'm working with Hypertherm right now, though, having gone through extensive lighting renovation work. And now we're working on all of their compressors. And as an example there, because the facilities managers there were a little bit resistant to any conversation because they were taking it as personal criticism. And so I have to tread this very careful line between understanding that, it's all very well and good that everything should be done now, but that's just not practical. And understanding the limitations of budget and the limitations of time and resources that many facilities managers operate under. So I'm trying to help them to prioritize, to pick the low-hanging fruit, and to support them and to deliver them incentives that will hopefully move things along faster. I hope that's a good answer for you.
Good answer. All right, Larry, and then any other new voices, and then we'll come back to you, Alice.
Yes. If Kendal here were to decide to have a full energy audit conducted, are there sources of revenue that we might turn to assist in offsetting some of the costs of that energy audit?
Well, Liberty Utilities, as part of the New Hampshire Saves program, does offer technical assistance, and often with Resilient Buildings Group and other auditing companies, there is a sort of cost sharing. So it does have to pass the analysis that they could definitely see electrical savings. I'll take an example of, recently one of the other churches I didn't mention had applied for an audit, and Resilient Buildings Group quoted it, and I took it to Liberty, and they turned it down because they couldn't see any potential for electrical savings. That said, I was able then to find separate funding through an interfaith church faith-based organization that did subsidize that. But as a general rule, you know, an audit where there's a clear potential goal of savings could well be subsidized by the program, yes.
Okay, you know, we're going to take a couple more questions, but if it continues to be difficult, Bob, let's give it a go. And Bob, you have to unmute.
How's
Got it.
that? Okay,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay. I'm a newcomer to New Hampshire. I've lived for 40 years in Vermont, and I was really pleasantly surprised by the results in Hanover and Lebanon with the retrofits and all of the things they've done. But I'm a little concerned about the rest of New Hampshire. Is there any reason to think that this isn't just a phenomenon of the Upper Valley, or are there other places in the state that we can look to?
Maybe I might speak to that if that's okay. Yes, you're right. You're making a good observation or a good point. There are other places. Durham is progressive. Portsmouth is a progressive community. In fact, Durham adopts the new code every time it comes out, whereas New Hampshire tends to lag behind by 6 years or more sometimes. So I think what it takes is leaders, right? It takes the towns. It takes like a town of Lebanon to demonstrate, and hopefully we haven't really talked to Lebanon about this, but hopefully Lebanon will kind of tout and tour and promote what they've done. They've done a really good job there with City Hall, a very progressive, aggressive, deep energy retrofit, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other historic mill type, brick buildings in the state that could certainly do a similar retrofit than what Lebanon City Hall did. So I think it takes examples. It takes examples, and then it takes owners who are excited about what they did to tout their good work. And we as a community should also be touting, hey, do you know what they did at Lebanon? Lebanon did it, and it's an old historic building. Why can't we do it with our old historic building or whatever? So there are other places around the state doing the same thing.
Anybody else with a question for either one of our presenters? Peter. Oh, Peter has, okay, never mind.
Arthur Holcomb.
Arthur, you need to unmute.
And it looks like Sharon too.
Yep.
I am new to the area and I don't know very much, but I'm wondering if there's value in us working more closely with Sustainable Hanover. I gather that it's a very dynamic operation, and I'm wondering what is the potential relationship between that operation and Kendal? And in that connection, is there any financial asset that can come from that side to help in what we're trying to do here?
And Dennis, feel free to speak up if you'd like to as well.
Well, I will. Sustainable Hanover is not a funding sort of organization, Arthur. But it's a good resource, and we have worked very closely, as Andrew has mentioned, with Andrew and what he's doing. So it's a very supportive role, and always looking for different ways to help. So I think that, well, the role I would imagine Sustainable Hanover would have is very supportive of what Kendal wants to do, and would be encouraging. I don't think we'd be much more than that, but I'm just a lonely secretary, so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sharon.
Yeah, so I was very pleased, having come from Vermont and being very displeased about New Hampshire, that net metering has just become the law. It's been written into law, and I'm wondering, I've like two questions that are the same. How will net metering, I think, is it 5 megawatts limit of net metering. Is that the right number? How will that help? Tell us how that will help us to convince management here at Kendal to start thinking about solar, especially since we're thinking about electric vehicle chargers and we want more, not 2. Also the second question is about geothermal. And do you do any work with geothermal?
Paul, I'm going to just suggest that you speak only because of the sound quality.
Yep, I'm okay with that. So let's see. So regarding the first question about net metering, I'm not a net metering expert, but I know a little bit about it. So for those who may not be familiar with net metering is a rule-making device that allows you to spin your electric meter backwards, basically. So it says if you have a solar electric system on your building or potentially other type of renewable energy system that produces electricity, you are allowed in the state of New Hampshire to sell that electricity back to the utility. In fact, the utility has a mandate to buy a certain percentage of their energy from renewable energy. So in most cases, they want your renewable energy. And you literally can run your electric meter backwards. It doesn't mean that at the end of the year, the utility is going to send you a check. If you produce more than you use, they'll basically just zero out your account. The 5 megawatts that I think it was Sharon was talking about, I'm a little bit less familiar with, but I believe that what you're referring to is there's a cap. The reason that there's a cap on the amount of energy, amount of electricity that can be net metered is that at some point, the utility can't handle large amounts or excessive amounts of electricity, right? So they don't have a way to store your electricity. If you're producing, all of these systems are almost all solar electric systems, which means on a bright sunny day, they're producing the most amount of electricity. If the utility doesn't need all of that electricity, it can't store it, or at least not quite yet. That technology is here and is coming, and some are experimenting with it, like battery storage, for instance. But the reason that the state imposes, or somebody like the Public Utilities Commission imposes, a 5 megawatt cap is largely to protect the utilities, so that the utilities aren't forced to purchase electricity that they can't really use. I think that's a fairly accurate synopsis. As I say, I'm not an expert in it. Let's see, and then the second question. Gosh, now Sharon, I apologize. Now I'm forgetting.
Basically,
You know what? Actually, Mary, to add to that question, is 5 megawatts enough? That cap to provide most of Kendal? I don't have any scale. Is that enough to provide Kendal during the summer?
Yeah, so maybe Andrew can speak to this too, because I think Andrew's looked at your bills perhaps, but 5 megawatts, 5 million watts is a very, very large, much more than what Kendal would use.
Okay.
So it's a very, very, very large amount. And I would guess that it's probably less than all of the solar electric systems that we have in the state now. So it allows for some room of expansion. And I'm guessing that, if you were to power all of Kendal with solar electric, that it would not exceed the 5 megawatt cap that the state has. I'm guessing.
Oh, thank you. That's really good information.
Yep. And if you could just give me one keyword about what your second question was, Sharon.
Oh, my second question was about geothermal.
Oh, yes. Have we done geothermal? Yes. So we've been involved with a handful of geothermal projects. I personally am a big fan of it. I think it makes perfect sense, because what you're doing is you're using the earth as a heat sink and a heat source. So if you think about it, in the wintertime, when the ground temperature is 55 degrees or so, you're basically pulling heat out of that 55-degree air. And as opposed to a conventional air source heat pump, like we were talking about earlier, which is trying to pull heat out of 10-degree air or whatever. So there's obviously much more heat capacity in the 55-degree earth than there is in the 10-degree air. So yeah, so in terms of efficiency, excuse me, it is probably the most efficient way to heat and cool buildings. There are increased capital costs because there are wells to be drilled. It's fairly sophisticated. It really requires some pretty sophisticated engineering, analysis of the soil conditions, calculations of how much water we need to drive through those pipes that are going in and out of the ground. But it can certainly be done. It's very efficient. And good way to go.
Thank you.
Michael, did you have a question? No. Okay.
I did have an observation. I'm delighted with the effectiveness of tonight's program in clarifying the picture for all of us. Tonight's news shared a startling observation related to what's been happening to our CO2 atmospheric burden since the Industrial Revolution began. And they made the observation that given that burden, 50% of it has accumulated in the air of our planet in the last 30 years.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Stu, I'm going to let you close out. This has been absolutely amazing. And then those of you that want to stay around may do so. Stu, go right ahead.
Oh, I just want to thank you guys for coming. These two people are probably the busiest people in New Hampshire, and to take the time to present to us this wonderful, fact-filled, inspiring presentation. I just thank you very much, both of you.
You are most welcome.
And I would encourage those of you that are not as yet working with either our education or our advocacy or our greening efforts here at Kendal to get involved, to learn about what's happening, to know that we're working with all levels here in hopes of pushing things forward. And again, thank to both of you for giving us, particularly those of us that aren't engineers, something very easy to comprehend and take in and to strengthen our case.
Great. Welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time, and I hope that we'll get to meet in person soon.
Absolutely. Thank you all.